Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Dr. Anjali Demari from the Department of English, Guwahati University. We are doing paper 13 now and the module is 34, South Asia, Bangladesh. In this module, you will be expected to have some knowledge about the politics of the region we are doing, that is Bangladesh. This module will allow you to look into the Bangladesh conflicts and the way war has impacted women in that country. The creation of East Pakistan in 1947 was marked by bloodshed. A major war in 1971 between West Pakistan and East Pakistan resulted in the foundation of present-day Bangladesh on 16 December 1971. The transition of East Bengal to East Pakistan in 1947 and from East Pakistan to Bangladesh in 1971 affected the civilian population of Bangladesh. Both these conflicts inflicted untold horrors on the women of this country. Bangladesh is a moderate Islamic country which is culturally more Bengali than Muslim. In 1971, the Constitution of Bangladesh incorporated in it the principles of nationalism, democracy, socialism, and secularism. 90% of the population is Muslim and it is basically an agrarian nation. Women in Bangladesh are politically empowered with 50 out of 350 seats being reserved for them in the parliament. The female literacy rate is also high with 72.03%, but it is still lower than that of males, which is 85.09%. They are thus intellectually sound and economically stable. While rural women work mostly as cultivators and laborers, semi-urban and urban women are engaged in government sector, teaching and healthcare. Though they are active both in private and public spaces, women's inheritance rights are discriminatory and patriarchal in nature. They inherit according to Sharia law. The history of the women's movement went through three distinct periods: 1900 to 1947, when the woman question emerged in Muslim Bengal; the Pakistan period of 1947 to 1970, and the Bangladesh period of 1972 to 1990, further subdivided into a look at how gender sensitivity was heightened among women in the post-war period of 1972 to 1974, and how the agenda was diversified and broadened during the 1970s. Bengali women of all religions in undivided Bengal played an important role in the independence struggle and in instituting social reforms. Women and women's groups also played pivotal roles in the Bangladesh Liberation War. The history of the women's movement in Bangladesh can be divided into three clearly differentiated phases. A. 1900 to 1947. This was the time when questions relating to women came to the forefront during the struggle for independence from England. B. The Pakistani period of 1947 to 1970, when questions relating to the rights of women were sidelined. C. The Bangladesh period 1972 to the present, when gender sensitivity became central post the violence inflicted on women during the Liberation War. Bangladesh has so far been ruled by two women prime ministers. Begum Khalida Zia of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party (BNP) was the Prime Minister of Bangladesh from 1991 to 1996 and again from 2001 to 2006. She was the first woman in the history of Bangladesh to hold this powerful post. Sheikh Hasina Wazir, leader of the Bangladesh Awami League since 1981, is the current Prime Minister. She earlier served as the Prime Minister from 1996 to 2001. This rosy picture is belied by Khushi Kabir, women's rights activist and chairperson of ADAB, Association of Development Agencies in Bangladesh. In an interview about the issues women in present-day Bangladesh, she is clear that in Bangladesh, women have not achieved any sort of equality, though Bangladesh has legislated equality. It is far from ensuring equality for female citizens. Bangladesh has signed the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women and Reservations. This section will examine three defining areas which have impacted the life of women in Bangladesh. 1. Women from Bangladesh in the Liberation War of 1971. 2. Violence in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. 3. Religious radicalism, which is seriously affecting the women in the region. The Liberation War of 1971. In 1952, Muhammad Ali Jinnah declared Urdu as the state language of both East and West Pakistan. This resulted in the language movement in Bangladesh because in East Pakistan, Bangla was the language in use. Bengali intellectuals believed that the imposition of Urdu was an attempt to destroy Bengali culture and identity. Protests were organized throughout East Pakistan as a part of the language movement. This is believed to be the beginning of the demand for independence from West Pakistan, which eventually led to the Bangladesh War of Liberation, a war which led to the systematic extermination of many Bengali intellectuals and the rape, torture and killing of thousands of women. Many women, especially students, were active participants in the language movement, and when the 1971 war broke out, the women who had earlier been involved in the Bengali nationalist movement became actively engaged in the war. Mainstream histories of the Liberation War concentrate on the victimization of women. Whenever the role of women in the 1971 war is discussed, it is women being mass raped by the Pakistani army and collaborators, treated as sex slaves, humiliated, discarded by civil society after the end of the war. The figures are more than just horrifying. 30,000 to 40,000 women were picked up, raped and confined by the Pakistani army. Susan Rowe Miller argued that what was unique to Bangladesh Liberation War was that the international community for the first time recognized that systematic rape could be used as a weapon to terrorize people. War was rape popularized in 1971 with the Pakistani army and Razakar militias raping hundreds of women from Bangladesh. It has resulted in numerous cases of sexually transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancies, suicides, abortions, and birth of war babies. Large numbers of women from both the Bengali-speaking Muslim majority and the Hindu minority of Bangladesh were victims of rape. The aim was to destroy Bengali nationalism. political scientist Adam Jones claimed that one of the reasons for the mass rapes was to undermine Bengali society through dishonoring Bengali women. In the genocide carried out by the Pakistani army, women were abducted, tortured and raped in rape camps set up by the Pakistani army in all towns and villages they went to. Many of these women eventually died of neglect and without recognition. Those who have survived are still looking for recognition and respect. Now let us look at the term Birangana. The extent of the violence that women had to face can be gauged by the fact that after the end of the war, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the first Prime Minister of Bangladesh, gave women raped during the war the title Birangana, which is often translated as brave woman or war heroine. The term was meant to create a space for the violated woman in a society where rape is largely a taboo topic and is often seen as the woman's fault. Financial and land rewards were offered to men who married the women in the hope that Birangana would be more quickly rehabilitated. Yet, the titling and incentives quickly backfired. The term was soon seen as a mark of shame, and many of the men who accepted the offer ended up leaving their new brides quickly after they received the rewards. Women became loath to identify themselves as Birogana, instead hiding their histories for fear of ostracism. The term Birangana was meant to honor the women who were violated, but women who were assaulted and raped were quickly forgotten and erased from memory. It was until I came across Naibuddin Ahmed's iconic photo of a Birangana, masses of hair, and her feet in a gesture that supplicated hate barred, covering her face, that it suddenly came to me that the Lakho Ma Boner Shotitto, the honor of hundreds and thousands of mothers and sisters, meant actual women, living, breathing beings. It wasn't until then that I began wondering where they were, why our school books taught us the names of the Bir Protiks, Bir Shrestha, Bir Uttam, but never those of the Birangana. This is Shabnam Nadia, who wrote about Birangana. The first attempt to record the voices of these ravaged women was by Nilima Ibrahim in Ami Birangana Bolchi, I, the Birangana, Speak, a compilation of the narratives of women raped and imprisoned during the Liberation War, published in 1997, 26 years after the war. This was translated by Dr. Fazal Rabi into English. The War Heroine Speaks. The process of documenting the voices of the Birangana, begun by Nilima Ibrahim, is contained by the Komala Collective. The tragedy of these women were subjected to torture and abuse continues because they were never accepted as people who paid a huge price for the liberation of their country. Women, after the Liberation War, had not only to deal with the shame of being raped, mutilated, they had to face the added trauma of the children they were about to bear. In 1972, the Bangladesh Women's Rehabilitation Board was formed to help the victims of rape with adoption procedures. However, the future of the war babies was uncertain. Many babies were separated forcibly from their birth mothers and were sent for adoption to foreign lands. It is doubtful whether these women were ever asked about what they felt about adoption. Society decided that the women could have no desire to to keep their children. Now let us have a look at the forgotten roles of women in the Liberation War. The unspeakable horrors unleashed on passive women were publicized, but in the process, the active role women played for the liberation of Bangladesh was forgotten. Women were only seen as victims of sexual violence. Women were victimized, but what is equally troubling is that their roles as combatants, informers, suppliers of arms, and nurses are largely forgotten by the government and society. Women were involved in the war in a variety of ways. While it was true that thousands of women were raped, there were also many who acted as spies and weapon smugglers who took up arms and fought. Both those who disguised themselves as men and those who served openly as women, who provided medical care in hospitals and in homes, who cooked food for and hid other fighters. In fact, for many women, they were raped specifically because of their active roles during the war. Yet, in remembering her role, she is only cited as a Birangana, not as a Mukti Juddha, freedom fighter, the title given to those who fought during the war. Now let's look at women fighting for justice. Women across Bangladesh have begun to assert their rights and fight for justice in innumerable ways. They have been in the forefront in demanding that war criminals be brought to justice. Jahanara Imam, in 3rd May 1929 to 26 June 1994, a Bangladeshi writer and political activist, was known as Shahid Janani, mother of martyrs. Her efforts to bring those accused of continuing war crimes in the Bangladesh Liberation War to trial brought her to public notice. In 1986, she published her wartime diary, Ekaturer Dinguli, The Days of 71, translated into English in 1990 as Of Blood and Fire, The Untold Story of Bangladesh's War of Independence. She supported her son Shafi Imam Rumi when he wanted to join the Bangladesh Liberation Movement. After he was killed in 1971, she did not allow her personal loss weaken her fight for justice. She founded an organization called Ekatorer Ghatak Dalal Nirmul Committee, which demanded trial of the people accused of war crimes during the Liberation War. She was charged with treason for this, but pardoned just days after her death. Her efforts bore fruit when Ali Ehsan Muhammad Mujahid was found guilty of killing Rumi, Bari Jewel, Azad and Atlaf Mahmud at the army camp set up in Nakhalpara, Dhaka during the Liberation War. B. Firdausi Priyabhashini, a famous sculptor, was one of the first women to fearlessly and publicly declare that she was raped by Pakistani soldiers. Her actions and that of many more like her is commendable given the nature of a society that had forced women to keep quiet about their experiences. Firdausi has been fighting for acceptance and justice for women who were raped and made to believe that they were somehow to blame for what had happened to them during the war. Years later, it has been discovered that how people with political affiliation and influence were engaged in war crimes in Bangladesh. Now let us go into violence in the Chittagong Hill tracts and the problems that were faced by indigenous women of Bangladesh. Post-independence, minority groups in the nation faced similar trouble in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. At CHT, the conflict continues between the Bengali settlers and the tribal inhabitants. CHT is a part of southeast Bangladesh and home to numerous ethnic groups like the Chakma, Marma, Chak, Murung, Lushai and others. Till 1947, Chittagong Hill Tracts comprised mostly of the tribal people, but post-1971 saw large-scale migration of Bengali Muslims into the area, thereby creating a suspicious and hostile environment. The Chittagong Hill Tract is an area of present Bangladesh, which had faced conflicts even when it was part of East Pakistan. The resentment of the people of this area can be traced back to the time when more than 100,000 people were displaced and not given any compensation when the Katpal Dam was built in 1962. Thousands of people were forced to flee to India. After the formation of Bangladesh, the indigenous people of the area sought autonomy, which was denied to them. Their representatives refused to accept the draft of the Constitution of Bangladesh because it did not recognize the ethnic identity and culture of the non-Muslim, non-Bengali peoples of Bangladesh. The government designated all citizens of Bangladesh as Bengalis. The indigenous people of the Chittagong refused to accept this identification. The conflict between the indigenous people of Bangladesh and the mainstream Bengali land grabbers in the Chittagong Hill Tracts have been increasing over the years. The indigenous people face severe discrimination, and in 2014, homes and properties of indigenous people were destroyed, forcing many of them to flee to Myanmar and India. The indigenous women have had to face displacement and have faced sexual and physical violence at the hands of the mainstream Bengalis and the security forces. The government of Bangladesh has ratified CEDAW, National Women's Development Policy NWDP, in 2011 and has endorsed a number of legal initiatives to promote human rights of women. However, the government does not have any distinguished laws or sections or articles or any specific development initiatives to address indigenous women's issues from their perspective, and NWDP contained very few provisions for indigenous women. In order to re-establish peace in the region, Bangladesh security and parliamentary forces were deployed in Chittagong Hills Tracts. However, the government under Khalida Zia allowed detentions without trials. The Hill people were tortured and faced extrajudicial executions. Women were sexually abused by the soldiers. Many young girls were tortured and raped in the presence of their relatives or when detained in military camps. The relocation of the Hill people from their traditional villages to strategic hamlets affected women's mobility and their livelihood. As such, the nutrition requirement and health of women are heavily affected. The brutal suppression of human rights at CHT gave birth to tribal insurgency, which further deteriorated the situation. Now let us come to a discussion of peace. In the face of such violence, a number of women's organizations have emerged to fight for the rights of women. Hill Women's Federation, HWF, is the representative organization of the indigenous women of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. It was founded on 8th March 1988 by some women students of Chittagong University. HWF focuses on consciousness raising about the rights and duties among women. It also organizes protests against human rights violations of indigenous women of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. HWF also raises its voice against military repression of indigenous women. In the first ever National Indigenous Women Conference held in Dhaka, indigenous women leaders and representatives of indigenous women's organizations formed a network naming Bangladesh Indigenous Women's Network, aiming at realizing their rights through social, economic, political and cultural movements. The two-day national conference was organized by Kapeng Foundation in cooperation with Oxfam at the CBCB Center in Dhaka on 31st March and 1st April 2012 with the slogan, "Come forward to establish equal dignity and right of indigenous women and to ensure violence-free life for them." A total of 23 indigenous women's organizations across the country attended the conference. Besides, women in Bangladesh have of late become victims of religious radicalism as well. In 1988, General Ershad amended the constitution by introducing Islam as the state religion. Clearly, the Hindus became the religious minorities. Even the Bangladeshi Muslims were in a dilemma as to what comes first, their loyalty towards Islam or towards Bangladesh. Various Islamic groups oppose women's liberation, Western codes of conduct, law and ethics, and dress and culture. They hail the Parda system. They favor the establishment of Sharia or Islamic law. The public trial of poor women by village elders and mullahs violate women's human rights. Organizations like Jamaat-e-Islami are emerging as an alternative to secular organizations. Madrasas, which are generally centers for classical Islamic studies, are described as jihad universities. In the name of a holy war, it has been seen how women's liberation is not a matter of concern for these educational institutions. There are, however, certain liberal madrasas as well which have interpreted the Holy Quran in a way favoring the rights of both sexes. The 1990 and 1992 violence in India in the wake of the Babri Masjid episode saw communal violence not just in India, but its effects were felt in Bangladesh as well. Both Hindu and Muslim girls were threatened and tortured by the enemy community. In present-day Bangladesh, the religious radicals are leaving no stone unturned to curtail the freedom of speech of women. Fatwas are issued against the NGOs working for women empowerment. Writers and bloggers are increasingly becoming the victims of religious orthodoxy. So in this module, which was on Bangladesh, we've seen how women have taken a very active role so far as the politics of the country was concerned. We've seen the prime ministers, the first prime minister, and following that another prime minister who's ruling the country. But in spite of that, we've seen how women over the years have also been at the receiving end of a number of Islamic radical policies which are followed by diverse groups. And though there have been attempts, to empower the women, to give them agency, and yet we also see at another level that there are indigenous women within Bangladesh who suffer from different kinds of problems. So in this particular module, we try to look into the different kinds of problems and difficulties which are faced not only by Bangladesh Muslim women, but as well as problems which are faced by the indigenous women of the Chittagong Hills Tract. Thank you.